I'm female, and this incident happened when I was in college. I was 20 at the time, and I lived in a big city where I went to school, but as a sculpture major, I had a lot of materials to transport between school and my apartment, so I ended up using my car more than public transit. One weeknight, I had been working late in the studio and decided to stop at the 24-hour drugstore chain on my drive home to pick up a few necessities. It was pretty late, probably about 2 a.m., so there weren't any other customers in the store, but there were 2 male cashiers around my age. After I had been there about 3 minutes, a new customer entered the store. He was male, late 30s, kinda jittery looking. He noticed me and started following me around the store in a really obvious way. I was trying to ignore him, get my stuff, and get out of there, but he came up to me and started doing this psst noise, like he was trying to discreetly get my attention. I kept ignoring him. Finally, he said, "Fuck you, bitch," and left the store. I figured, whatever, weirdo. As I paid for my stuff, I had this overwhelming gut feeling to ask the cashier if he wouldn't mind walking me out to my car, since that jittery guy had creeped me out so much. The cashier said it was cool, and we made our way out to the parking lot. I was feeling more at ease about halfway to my car, and I turned to say thanks to the cashier for his help when he grabs my shoulder and says, "That guy is under your car." Sure enough, that fucking jittery guy was under my car. The cashier shouts, "What the fuck are you doing? I'm calling the police." The guy starts scrambling out from under my car, and the cashier and I run back in the store, and he immediately calls the cops. It scared me pretty good. He ran away before the cops got there. I sometimes wonder what he would have done to me if I hadn't asked the cashier to walk me out. Grabbed my foot? Stabbed me with something? Just let me run him over? This happened to me a couple months ago. I was driving home from work at 2 a.m. I'm a nurse and I live in a small city. The roads were totally deserted and it was a freezing night. I don't live far from work, maybe a couple of miles. I was driving down a residential street around the corner from my house when I see a man lying face down in the street. Now, since I'm a nurse, my first thought was, great, I gotta help this guy up. I was coming off a long shift and falls happen all the time. As I slowed down the car, I suddenly realized what an idiot I was being. I'm a 100-pound woman and I don't carry any weapons. I thought I should still do something to help the guy, so I called 911 as I drove past and slowed to a stop at the end of the block. While I was stopped at the light, I explained to the dispatcher that there was a man in the road who might need assistance. All of a sudden, I hear a loud bang, bang from the driver's side window. I screamed and looked over. A man was pounding on my window and jiggling the handle of my locked car. I looked in the rearview mirror and saw that there was no man lying in the street anymore. Still on the phone with 911, I screamed, "I'm so scared," to the dispatcher and floored it through the red light. I quickly told him what had happened, and even though I was right by my house, he told me to keep driving. After a few minutes, I had calmed down, and he told me to loop back around. I pulled over down the road from my house and stayed in the car. I didn't see the man anywhere, so I finally got off the phone with the dispatcher. He told me he was sending a police car to cruise the area. As I gathered up my things to do a final scan of the area, I see the man. He was walking with 2 other men. I hunched way down in my car until they were far down the road, then bolted into my house. I don't know if he had ill intent, but it freaks me the hell out knowing that he wasn't alone. After this, I'll always remember to lock my car doors. I'd like to start off by saying that this story is completely true, even though only a few people I tell in real life believe it. and it's probably possible to find a newspaper article about it if you look hard enough. When I was around 7 or 8, I would sleep on the couch in the living room during the weekend so that I could watch TV or play N64 as late as I wanted. My parents were very adamant about me not having a TV in my room and didn't like me using electronics during the school week, so these nights were pretty amazing to me. I had full control of the remote and could even watch some of the shows that I wasn't supposed to after my parents went to bed. Being a little kid, I usually couldn't make it past 11 o'clock anyway, so my parents didn't mind allowing me this small freedom. One night, I had already fallen asleep with the TV on when I was awoken by noises coming from our front porch. My living room was located at the front of the house and had large bay windows that looked out over the front yard, but they also made it possible to view the porch if you pressed yourself against the glass and looked at an angle. I was terrified, but I was scared I would get in trouble for waking my parents up about nothing, so I slowly crept towards the bay windows. I held my breath as I leaned against them and saw something that I can still clearly see in my mind to this day. It was a middle-aged woman, probably in her late 30s, wearing dingy clothes, sitting on our front porch swing, just looking out into the yard, not moving. Her clothes were covered in blood, and she kept swinging on our swing, holding a kitchen knife, while I stood frozen for well over a minute. Finally, my muscles unlocked and I sprinted to my mom's room to wake her up. Being terrified and only 7, I forgot how to work a doorknob, so I just ended up pounding on my parents' door until they woke up. I was in hysterics trying to tell them what I saw, but I wasn't making any sense and they just assumed I had been having a bad dream. I finally calmed down enough to explain what had happened, and they told me that I had had a nightmare and that there was nothing to worry about. They told me to get into bed with them, but I wouldn't stop crying and begging for them to get out of bed. Finally, my dad angrily got up to prove that I was just dreaming and roughly dragged me to the front door. I tried to tell him not to open it, but he walked straight to the door, slung it open, and said, "See? Nothing." Suddenly, the look on his face changed from anger to pure terror in a split second as the woman turned from the front porch swing and stared directly at us. He slammed the door shut, locked the door, and told my mom to call the police, while he went and got his shotgun. He told me to stay in his room, but I could still hear him as he stuck the barrel of the gun out of the door and demanded to know what she was doing. I couldn't hear her, and my parents refused to tell me for years what had happened, but apparently she just kept saying, "Someone killed my husband, but it wasn't me." My dad told her he had called the cops and to stay where she was. Eventually, she just walked off our porch and continued walking down the street. The cops found her a few minutes later, wandering around another house in the neighborhood, but luckily we had already called and warned everyone that we knew. To this day, I refuse to sleep on the couch. When I was 6 years old, my favorite thing to do was explore the woods by my house. I never went into the thicket alone. My friend Ethan liked to join me, but sometimes it would just be me and my neighbor Katrina, who was 7 at the time. To get to the woodsy area, you had to first cross a large tree fallen over a small ravine. Something I would never do now, but at that age, I was fearless. My friends and I spent many days daring each other to cross back and forth over the tree without using our arms for balance. One particularly dreary summer day, I asked Ethan and Katrina to explore with me, but Ethan wasn't feeling too well, so he stayed home. Katrina and I set off to the obscure path that led to the fallen tree and spent a couple hours in the woods. I remember the smell of the woods and the damp, slippery feel of the leaves beneath my feet. It had rained the night before, and the woods were electric with the sound of birds chirping and water rushing through the ravine. We were so entranced. I guess that's why we didn't hear the man approach us. My first thought was to get the hell out of there. I knew all about stranger danger, and I just had this weird feeling about this middle-aged man approaching us. Before I could tell Katrina what I was thinking, the man told us we looked like we were great explorers and that he could really use our help. He said his puppy ran off into the woods and she wouldn't be able to take care of herself, so it was really important to find her soon. I hesitated, but Katrina had always had a weakness for puppies, so she agreed to help him look. We set out to look for the missing puppy, but I just kept getting this weird feeling. Every time we walked towards the direction the man came from, he would tell us that he had already looked over there and that we should keep to the other side. After a while, I was done. I was ready to nope the fuck out of there, but Katrina wouldn't budge. I told her I was leaving, and she said she was going to stay. I wanted to beg her to come with me, but I decided to leave without her because I couldn't stand being there any longer. I jogged back through the woods, careful not to slip on any damp leaves, but the fallen tree was covered in them, so I had to tiptoe my way across. Halfway across, a chill went through my body, leaving a trail of goosebumps on my skin, and I just ran. I ran so fast, I forgot how slippery the log was, so I didn't even realize I was falling into the ravine until I had already hit the rocky bottom. I heard a loud crack and looked down to see that my femur was broken and sticking through my skin. Things got foggy after that, but I guess I screamed loud enough for the closest neighbors to call 911. I'm just happy I screamed loud enough to save Katrina. The police and EMTs found me lying in the ravine crying and grasping my broken leg. The last thing I remember was pointing towards the woods and telling them to look for Katrina. I woke up the next day with my leg hooked up to the ceiling in a world of pain. My mom was holding my hand, and she said that when I was ready, the police would like to talk to me. I asked if I was in trouble, but she said it was nothing like that. They just needed to ask me a few questions. A policeman came in and asked me if I had seen a man in the woods before I broke my leg. I recounted the events that happened and asked if they found Katrina. I felt relieved when they said they had. Apparently, when I left, the man started asking Katrina about her family and asked her if she had any big, scary brothers that would come looking for her if she was out too late. Their conversation was cut short by my screams, and Katrina immediately ran towards the sound. Luckily, the man's reflexes weren't as fast, and even though he tried, he never caught up with her. She said when she looked around at the end of the woods, he was running back into them. She thought that maybe he was going to get help. Turns out, there was no lost puppy. The police never found the creepy man, but they did find a bag hidden in the bushes by where we first spotted him. Inside the bag was rope, duct tape, and a pair of binoculars. Sometimes I have nightmares about what could have happened that day, and even now I get chills when I go into those woods. This story happened about 10 years ago. I'm 29 now, but at the time I was jobless and desperate. I finally found a job as a security guard in an office building. The building was in a forested area, away from any busy streets, completely secluded. The person who had the job before me had been in a car accident and was now paralyzed from the waist down. Nobody else was interested since you worked during the night and the office building was so big. It was boring as hell, but hey, a job is a job. Once I started, I trained with a supervisor for a week. This was my first night working by myself. I came to work and took the shift over from my colleague at 9 p.m. He told me there were still some people left in the building. Before I went up to the 15th floor where the lingering employees were working, I closed up the main entrance and locked it from the inside, so no outsiders could come in. After I did this, I went up to the 15th floor to ask the remaining employees if they needed to go anywhere else in the building. They all said no, so I was able to make my rounds and close off the other floors. So I made my rounds, found nothing peculiar, and went back to my front desk. This was around 11:30 p.m., and the people who were working on the 15th floor were finally leaving. After a while, someone told me he was the last one to leave and wished me a good night. Once he had left, I went up to the 15th floor and checked all the offices and locked it down. I went down to my front desk again. Since there was no one left in the building, I turned on the motion detector alarms on every floor, except for the ground floor where my desk was. Within 5 minutes of turning the alarms on, the alarm went off on the 10th floor, but I was sure there was no one left in the building. The rule is that if an alarm goes off, you first call the security company before you take action. I told them I would investigate the alarm and that I would call them back once I checked it out. Otherwise, if I don't call back, they would send a police car to check it out, just as a precaution. I checked the whole 10th floor and found nothing, so I went and called the security company back and told them it was a false alarm. Ridiculously enough, the alarm on the 10th floor kept going off, about 7 times every hour. Every time I checked the floor, I couldn't find anything out of order. Since this was my first day working alone, and the alarm had went off so many times, the security company thought I was screwing things up and wanted to file a complaint to my boss. The last thing I wanted to do was lose a job I had only been working for a week. In retrospect, the following was the dumbest thing I could ever do. The alarm went off again, and since I didn't want to call the security company again and cry wolf, I went up to the 10th floor without informing them. The only thing I had on me was a mag light, since security guards in the Netherlands aren't allowed to carry guns. I went up to the 10th floor, checked everywhere, and just as before, found nothing. I decided to pretend to leave, turning the lights off and hiding on the floor, listening to see if someone was there. In about 5 minutes, I heard something moving. I was relieved and anxious at the same time. Relieved I wasn't wrong, but anxious because I had no idea what could be there. I turned on the lights and tried to sound as manly as possible while ordering the intruder to show themselves. As you can imagine, no response. Stupidly, instead of calling for help, I went looking for whatever it was wandering around on the 10th floor. I walked to the room I had heard the sound from, turned on the lights, and found a little girl who couldn't be older than 13, with long brown hair, in white pajamas, squatting and rocking front to back on a desk, looking straight at me. The scariest thing was there was no emotion in this girl's face or in her eyes. After almost shitting myself, I collected my nerves and took the girl by the hand. Now, as a 6'8" guy, I didn't feel very threatened by this little girl. I took her down to the front desk and offered her a Coke, but she didn't respond whatsoever. The only thing I could do was call my supervisor and tell him what I had encountered. My supervisor said to stay there and that he'd be right over. While waiting for him to arrive, I had this unnerving feeling about the girl, that there was something really wrong with her. Before my supervisor turned up, he called me back and told me to call a local asylum that was really close to the building just to check if a patient was missing. He was worried because he couldn't imagine why there would be a 13-year-old girl wandering around an office building if there were no houses or families living nearby. I called the asylum and asked if anyone was missing, and got the worst response I could have imagined. They said yes. As a matter of fact, someone was missing. I described the girl sitting next to me, and they confirmed that the description matched the missing patient. They told me she was really dangerous and that I should watch my back at all costs. They immediately sent people over to retrieve the girl. A week later, my supervisor told me what the people from the asylum had explained about this girl. It turns out she had killed her parents and brother while they were sleeping when she was only 11. During her stay at the asylum, she would constantly wound staff members by stabbing them with pencils. She had even bitten a piece of someone's ear off. To this day, we still have no clue how or why she got in. We checked all the cameras and there was no footage of her ever entering the building.